Good evening, everyone, and welcome back, and welcome to any newcomers for the Sheep Essentials webinar, part 2. I'm Dominic. I'll be the host tonight. A little bit about the project. StockSense is run by the VFF, and it's funded by the Cattle Compensation Fund and the Sheep and Goat Compensation Fund. And it's proudly delivered by the VFF Livestock Group. StockSense was established to help Victorian livestock producers maintain and improve animal health and welfare and Victoria's overall biosecurity status. And we do this through workshops, webinars such as this one. We have an e-newsletter which you can sign up for, and we also have fact sheets online. This is how you can stay in touch. There's our website and also our email address if you have any questions. A couple of upcoming workshops and events I thought I'd point out. We have a lambing webinar series next week, and there's a button up here. You can click on our VFF events, hopefully, and register. And that webinar series is separate to this one, so you'll need to register for that if you'd like to attend. We also have 2 stock handling and yard design workshops coming up in Mortlake and Yea. And we have our annual VFF Livestock Conference in Bendigo on the 17th of July. So last week we were joined with Dr. Alison Gunn, and she covered part 1 of this series, which looked into biosecurity, such as traceability, and considerations when buying livestock, such as disease and what to look out for when buying in animals. Tonight will be part 2, and we will focus on parasite management, vaccinations, and the importance of a vet-client relationship. A little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in the box, and we'll try to answer those at the end. And we've allocated about an hour for the presentation and 30 minutes afterwards. A reminder, slides will be sent out to you via an email, and also there'll be a link to the recording and to the feedback form. And if you'd like to check out past StockSense webinars, you can do so by visiting our YouTube channel, VFF StockSense, and there's a number of sheep, cattle, and goat webinars on there. So Alison, welcome back. Alison's the owner of Herd Solutions, which is a vet and consultancy business in East Gippsland. Thanks for joining us again, Alison. I'll hand it over
Thank you,
to
John.
Cheers.
Yep. Okay, we'll just have to do the flick over again. So let me just share screen. Which I think is this one. And then we'll go here. So hello, everybody, and good to see you back again. And hopefully we can find you some more interesting facts and helpful information to manage your property from tonight's presentation. You got that up on the screen now, Dom?
That looks good. I can see that.
Excellent. That's really good. Okay. So we're covering some of the topics we covered last time in the biosecurity section, but we're now looking at the prevention and management of those diseases on farm. As always, there's a lot to cover in this webinar, and there's a lot of things that are very specific to your own farm. So my plan with this webinar was to really give you the key things you need to be thinking about, but then you need to go to your animal health professional, like your vet, and it's always good to have that relationship with your vet, because then when you want to call them out, they know who you are, and it's probably easier to get a vet when you're call after hours and all that sort of thing. But go and get that good advice on how to actually apply this on your farm, because there's so many different farms across the state, so many different situations. I can't give very specific advice. And so my plan with this presentation is just to give you a whole heap of things you might need to think about and put together and work out a plan for your farm. As a part of our business, we do a lot of animal health planning because it is quite complicated, and no one farm is exactly the same. So let's talk about worms. So worms are the biggest challenge in sheep. Whether you're a hobby farmer or whether you're a large farmer, I know farmers are getting out of sheep, and one of the reasons is they're finding the drench-resistant worms are so hard to deal with. And depending on how your climate is changing, it's sometimes making it a bit worse as well. So They're basically so we're talking about parasites, both internal and external parasites, but worms and fluke are your biggest challenges with sheep, particularly worms, and um, they have a significant impact on sheep health. They're a cause of a lot of losses if they're not controlled. And the most important thing is it's no longer possible just to rely on drenches to fix your problem. In fact, just relying on drenches is probably going to cause you more of a problem. So first of all, let's understand the worm. So worms have several life stages. The L3 larva, the third stage of the larva, is ingested by the sheep while eating grass. It goes into the sheep, it develops into a male and a female adults, which mate, and then they produce eggs, and the eggs come out, they hatch out, they go through several stages in the feces, and then they end up hatching up and crawling up the grass again. So this is just a good example of one of the things we can do to control worms, because the worms will generally only crawl about 5 centimetres up the grass. You will get some up to 15 centimetres, but short grass is a really big risk for getting worms. If you can manage your rotational grazing, so you've got long grass ahead of you, particularly for those susceptible animals like your pregnant ewes and your lambing ewes and your newly weaned lambs, that's going to really help with the control, because when the sheep are eating down deep into the grass, it's when they're picking up most of the worms. So for those of you that don't know this, you can see my mouse. Can you see my mouse, Dom? Moving around there?
Yeah, I can
Right.
see that.
See the mouse? Yeah.
Yellow.
So this is a droplet of water on a sheath of grass. This is a real life photo. And in that droplet of water are hundreds of little larvae just waiting for a sheep to come along, or a cow, and eat it all up. And that's how they infect the sheep. So principles of parasite control. Using drenches, yes, but it needs to be strategic, informed, and you need to understand the drenches you're using. Grazing and pasture management is a really key part of it. It's possible to breed for resistance. Resistance is moderately heritable, so it's something you should be considering when you're purchasing rams. Making sure you've got good nutrition. High protein feed is a really good way of helping keep away worms, and regularly monitoring so that you know whether you need to drench or not, rather than just giving them a drench without knowing whether they need it. So talking about grazing and pasture management, we want to have those low worm risk paddocks for vulnerable sheep. So that might be that you're going to graze those paddocks with cattle and have them no sheep on them for quite a few months before you actually lamb or wean, that you have enough opportunity to grow long grass if that's possible. And I imagine for most of the state that's actually quite difficult at the moment. But where you can, and to do things like drench your sheep and graze adult sheep that have been, particularly wethers are good, but have been wormed, and so they're not shedding worm eggs on pastures, and then keep those pastures locked up until you need to wean or lamb. So there's a whole heap of ways you can prepare low worm risk paddocks. Rotational grazing is an important, particularly for things like barber's pole, which only survive in the environment when it's hot for 28 days through to maybe 6 or 7 weeks. And I've had good success with some clients who basically move their sheep every 4 days, because it takes 4 days for those worm eggs to hatch out and get to the infective stage. So if they move their sheep out of the paddock within 4 days and they don't come back into that paddock for 5 or 6 weeks, with barber's pole particularly, that's a good way of controlling it. Unfortunately, the scour worm, and I'll talk a bit later about the types of worms, but unfortunately the scour worms last in the pasture a lot longer. So it's not such a great way of controlling those. But in the summer, if you have barber's pole, then that is a good way of controlling it. So trying to get longer grass, I've covered that, and then grazing cattle or making hay or silage to reduce contamination, and finishing your lambs early. So growing your lambs fast, maybe even growing them out on crops and that sort of thing. The quicker you can get your lambs off the farm, like lambs often shed high numbers of worm eggs, so getting them off the farm and reducing your pasture contamination. Good nutrition is a really good thing for supporting immunity to worms. So, weaning your lambs onto chicory and plantain and good clover crops that have got high protein are often a very good way of keeping worms under control. Making sure that you know when your pasture growth rate and your pasture's declining, and with those high risk animals like young animals and ewes, particularly putting supplements in as the pasture quality declines rather than having them just run out and eating really short grass. And trying to keep your ewes at condition score 3 or above, again, particularly pregnant ewes that have twins, and maybe a little bit less if you know they're going to have singles, but focusing on those young sheep. And if you've got a small property, it might be important just to maybe drench the young sheep rather than drench everything. For most big properties, farmers have tended to go and drench everything, but for managing it on a small property, it may not be the way to go. And I'll explain more about that later. So talking about breeding for resistance, if you're purchasing your rams off a registered stud, they'll often have an Australian sheep breeding value for those sheep, and drench resistance is moderately heritable. Now, for most people, it's not necessarily going to be the main reason you buy that ram, but it's something you should consider. So the number you get is representative of the worm egg count as a group. So it's Australian sheep breeding value. And the more negative the number, the more resistant that animal is going to be. The lower the worm egg count is going to be in that animal compared to the mob of sheep it's in. So if you're looking at merinos, the average currently at the moment is about 13%. So you want to be looking lower than that. And particularly some composite breeds have got very low WEC ASBV. So if you're struggling with worms and you are looking at purchasing rams, definitely consider worm egg counts and the ASBV for that as something you can look against. So one of the things that's become really important in the last few years, and some people find difficult to understand, is this thing called refugia. But what you need to know is you can't get rid of all worms. No drench will get rid of the entire worms in a sheep's gut. And what we aim for as an effective wormer is 95% efficacy. And so if you drench a sheep and all it's got is a handful of resistant worms and put it on a paddock that's clean and not had any sheep on, all the worms on that paddock are going to be resistant to the chemical you just drenched it with. And so that's how you quickly and rapidly, and I've seen this happen on farms quite commonly, is how you quickly and rapidly end up with a heap of resistant worms on your farm. And even if you sell those sheep, the worms are still going to be there. So you need to not end up in that situation to start with. So looking at this diagram here, the refugia is the population of susceptible parasites that haven't been exposed to wormers. So they're the ones kicking around in the paddock when you go and drench the sheep. So on the, where it says low refugia, I'm not sure whether your left and right's going to be the same mine, but I think on the left-hand side, where it says low refugia, there's the red symbols are basically your resistant larvae and the blue are the susceptible ones. So there's quite a lot of resistant ones there. Whereas you've got high refugia, you've actually got a lot of larvae there which are susceptible to all the wormers. And they're the ones you want to repopulate the sheep's gut because you're never going to get rid of the worms. So the last thing you need is a paddock full of resistant worms to repopulate the sheep's gut. So what we used to say is lock your sheep up, put them on a clean paddock. What we now say is lock your sheep up after drenching or drench them and then put them back in the paddock they've come from, which should be full of susceptible worms, and reinfect them with those for a few days and then move them onto the clean paddock. So you're taking those susceptible worms around the farm with them because you're never going to get rid of them and you just need to manage them with your drenches. Another thing you can think of doing, particularly for Barber's pole, is what's called Formica, and it's basically an anemia guide. So of the several worms we've got, scaleworm makes them scour and Barber's pole makes them anemic. And this way you can look at the lower eyelid. It's important to look at the lower eyelid, not the gums or anything else like this. So roll out the lower eyelid and look at their colour. And if they're nice and pink or moderately pink, you probably don't need to drench them. But if they're very pale and white, and certainly that one again across the right-hand side, where it's very white, that means it's extremely anemic and that sheep is at risk of dying. When you get them that colour, you're probably best to drench them where they are and leave them where they are rather than trying to run them into the yards. So you're trying to keep your sheep nice and pink. And that way, if you've got a very small flock of sheep and you don't want to build up drench resistance, you may be able to monitor, particularly in the summer if you have barber's pole, and be able to decide when to drench. Similarly, in the winter where you have more scourworm, you can drench the ones that are scouring and not the ones that are not. So it is easy to use selective drenches, and in some countries that's because they only have a couple of actives, that's all they do. But because we've had lots of options on different drenches and it's been easy, most commercial farmers give everything a drench, and that's certainly something I'd support. But if you've got a small number of sheep, looking at selective treatment might be a good way to go to minimise building up worm resistance on your farm, particularly if you haven't got many paddocks and it's difficult to manage your pastures. So going back to our refugia again, here he says to basically treat them, we leave them in the paddock with all the susceptible worms, you wait for a few days, and then you move them onto a clean pasture and they're going to take those susceptible worms with you, not just a lot of resistant worms. So there are some times when I'd recommend you routinely drench, and they would mainly be weaning and pre-lambing, and at some point in the summer, and depending on where you are. So over here in the east of the state where I am, we get a lot of summer rainfall, so it's really hard to prepare worm-safe paddocks because we've always got worms on the paddock and then we don't have the time when the paddocks dry out. So you need to get advice for your area on the best way of summer drenching. There's really good advice on the Worm Boss website. So I'll mention them a bit later on, but there's Worm Boss, Fly Boss and Lice Boss, and we're looking at worms, lice and flies. That should be the place you go because they're very targeted, specific Australian recommendations and recommendations for each state. What I'd strongly recommend is for the rest of the time when you want to drench, you should do a worm egg count, drop it off at your local vet, your local feed store. Some feed stores will do it for free, and find out if your sheep need drenching. And if they don't need drenching, then you leave them and check a few weeks later. And by using this, I've got some farms that this year have decided to do this, and sometimes they've actually managed not to drench some more resistant classes of sheep, like their dry ewes that they're not pregnant at the time, for even 4 or 5 months. So instead of just drenching them all the time, knowing when you need to drench. One of the things that will come out of this presentation is it's actually quite technical and it's quite important to understand the different chemicals you're using. So rather than going in and asking your feed supply merchant or whoever sells you your drenches, it's probably a good idea to understand your different drenches yourself and write down and record what you are using, because if you don't understand what the different types of drenches are, it's going to be quite difficult, or you're very quickly going to end up with drench resistant if you keep using the same type of drench. One thing we're quite keen on in the sheep world particularly is to use combination drenches, because we know that if we've got more than one active in there, we're less likely to get resistance. And another thing you can do is test your drench efficacy. So that's called a fecal egg count reduction test. You do it ideally at weaning with lambs that have never been drenched. You drench them with a whole heap of different types of drenches. You need about 70 lambs for this. You drench them with all the different types of drenches when you know they've got worms there, and then you see which ones are working and which ones aren't. And from that, you can formulate a really good drench program using the drenches that work and understand what is not working or what is at risk of not working on your farm. Another key recommendation is to quarantine and treat all introduced sheep, because buying in sheep, you're very likely to be buying in resistant worms. So I'll talk about quarantine drenching in a second. Going back to that fecal egg count reduction test, that is probably definitely one again you need to, if you want to do it, go and talk to your animal health advisor, go talk to your vet and get some good advice on how and when to do it. It does take a little bit to set up, but you can get some really, really good results about it. And here over in the east at the moment, we're running a produce demonstration site just looking at fecal egg count resistant tests going on. So, making the right decisions, use your worm egg counts, your fecal egg counts. There's a number of labs you can send those to. Most of the time, you just need a worm egg count. Sometimes you actually might want to do a larval culture. A larval culture will tell you what types of worms are there. Only drench when it's indicated by the monitoring, and there's different thresholds for different types of worms at different times of years. We have different cutoff thresholds. Look at doing a drench resistance test every 2 or 3 years, and particularly have a good record for the treatments, when you use it, which type of treatments you use, etc. One of the other things you need to consider is when you do a long-acting drench, you should always give it. So there's one long-acting type of drench, it's called amoxidectin. It really should only be used over lambing in times you don't want to get your animals in and drench them again in a short period. If you start using that as your standard way of drench control and you're using it a lot of the time, you'll very quickly build up resistance. And I've been seeing quite a lot of resistance even to the long-acting drench if it's given by itself. So with that long-acting drench, it's really important that you give it with what we call a primer, which is another drench with different actives in it. Should at least have 2 or 3 other actives in it. And this is normally done before lambing, that you give that long-acting drench 4 weeks before lambing, so that, because that moxidectin is excreted in the milk at high doses, so that level has dropped by the time the lambs are born. And then before you are marking, you do another worm egg count. And if there's worm egg counts increasing, there's worms there, you actually need to give what's called a tail cutter. So we don't have that long-acting drench, which is the levels getting lower and lower and lower and lower. And it eventually gets to the stage where you're just promoting resistant worms. So my message here is basically avoid long-acting drenches where you can, and where you do use it, you must give a primer and you must give a tail cutter. So I've mentioned a bit about the different worms, but what have we got? So the key ones we see here that we're worried about are the black scale worm, and they're the ones we see mainly over the winter because their larvae probably prefer better, cooler times. And the problem with them is their eggs can survive in the pasture, in the feces, for months and months and months. So, and they don't produce many eggs, so often we don't need a very high worm egg count before we need to drench them. The ones we see in the summer are the brown stomach worm and the barber's pole worm. And with the barber's pole worm, those eggs hatch out very quickly. They actually hatch out in 4 days and only last for 4 to 6 weeks. But they produce lots and lots and lots of eggs, so we actually have a higher threshold to go into drench. Another one we commonly see is the tapeworm. And while we see a lot of tapeworm, that's in that top picture there, they are actually not pathogenic. So while some of the drenches treat for tapeworm, they're actually not a worm we need to really worry about. The ones we need to worry about are scale worm, our stomach worm, and our barber's pole worm. So as I said earlier, it's really important to understand all the different actives you're going to use, and to know that some of these products with very similar names are actually related. So ivermectin, avermectin, and zidectin, for instance, are all part of a class called mectins. And when you start getting resistance to one, you're likely to get resistance to all. So having a good understanding of the different type of drenches and how they're related is quite important. This slide, you all get the slides that Dom's going to send out, but this basically talks about that, or shows you the different type of drench we got. So we have the benzimidazole, which are generally called white drenches because they are white. There's 3 different sorts of those. We have levamisole, which is a clear drench. We have what we call the macrolytic lactones, but easier to call them the mectins. And then we also have a praziquantel, which is used for the tapeworm. And then we've also got some newer drenches, so monopantel and quantal, and those are pretty broad spectrum, but we are already seeing resistance to those drenches, and there are no more drenches in the pipeline. So once all these stop working on your farm, there is really nothing else that you'll be able to use. Organophosphates are an old type of drench. You have to be really careful in how you use them, because you don't want to overdose them. Because they're organophosphate, they're a little bit harsher type of a drench. There is some resistance, but we tend to use it in a combination with a white and a clear, and often it works quite well. And then the final drench type is called clisantol. That is a that affects only your barber's pole worm. So with a thing like an Abamect Dual, it only really has one wormer that kills everything in it, which is abamectin, and the clisantol is only against the barber's pole. So when you see clisantol, bear in mind it only really treats your barber's pole worms. Okay, so going back to quarantine drenching, I mentioned this last week as well. But if you are going to be trading or buying sheep, it's really important to drench them onto your farm. And while I said that the drenches don't get rid of everything, what you don't want to do is bring in a heap of resistant worms. And what you've got to realize is if you can't do a really good quarantine drench and you use an ineffective quarantine drench, then you will be bringing in a heap of resistant worms. So the standard recommendations, and this is again where a good vet relationship comes into play, because sometimes your vets can buy barrels of this. They've got enough sheep clients, they might be able to sell you enough for a small number of sheep if you're a smaller producer. But Startec or Zolvix are the new actives, and you should include those in your quarantine drench together with at least 3 different types of actives. So that might be a white and a clear and a mectin, or it might be a white and a clear and a polax, something like that. But whatever you use, you should have at least 4 different drench types that you give to the sheep when they come in. And then you need to have a really nice wormy paddock that your sheep have probably only been on quite recently, and actually put them in there so they pick up the susceptible worms you've hopefully got on your farm. And so that dilutes any resistant worms that you bring in. If you don't do that, then you really run the risk of a rapid increase of resistant worms on your property. So there's a whole heap of different worm regimes out there. It's certainly not something we can cover on a webinar. It's something you need to go and get an advice from your vet, get a really good plan on how to treat your sheep, but you need to have that integrated approach. You can't just rely on wormers. You can't just rely on worming your sheep 4 or 5 or 6 times a year, because you're going to end up, and I'm already seeing on a lot of farms, with a lot of drench resistance. Okay. You need to combine your drenches with pasture management. Try and have long grass where you can. Try and move your sheep out of your paddocks fast if you've got small enough blocks, etc., and don't bring them up for a while. Look at your nutrition, because that good nutrition will actually help support. Look at your genetics and make sure you monitor. So all these ways reduces the reliance on chemical and slows the resistance that's going to develop. And it's going to, it's not, it might. As long as you're using chemicals, you're going to end up with resistance. There's a whole heap of ways of addressing it. One way might be to use one active for 3 or 4 drenches, and then change after for another 3, 4, and then change for another 3 or 4. So there's a whole heap of ways of addressing it. But what you don't want to do is keep using the same types of drench all the time. You need to be mixing them up, and you need to be getting good advice as to the best way to do that. The other place you can look for advice is Worm Boss, which I've already mentioned. Okay, so that's all I was going to cover on worms. So the other thing we're going to look at is the external parasites. So our sheep body lice, which is causing itching, rubbing, and fleece damage, where your sheep are always rubbing and the wool is coming off them, and blowflies, which cause fly strike, and that is another major welfare issue. Again, we can manage it, and again, we need to take an integrated approach. So sorry, I hope you're not eating your dinner, but let's have a look at how to minimize fly strike. So what are the causes of fly strike? So this is basically just showing you there's a whole heap of reasons why we get fly strike, and that means there's a whole heap of reasons, things we can do to control it. Okay, so having DAGs, having urine stains, different nutrition, the way we tail dock, genetics again, rainfall, fleece colour, wind speed. There's all sorts of things we can do, that all sorts of reasons why sheep get fly strike, and all sorts of things we need to do to control it. Again, we need to understand the life cycle. So the life cycle is about 17 days, and basically you've got your maggots. They merge from the eggs, they molt a couple of times. On the sheep, they eat into the flesh of the sheep, and then they drop and they burrow into the soil, they pupate, and then they emerge, and the whole cycle goes again. So understand that there's a life cycle and it takes a few days. And particularly, we are worried about the Australian sheep blowfly, who's called Lucilia cuprina. Quite a nice name for quite an ugly animal, I think, but that's what it is. And it's responsible for more than 90% of the fly strikes, and then the other types of flies come in. You need to use your management tools. You need to look at crutching, shearing, tail docking, and getting your tail docking right. You need to think again about selecting sheep for resistance. That's your breech traits, your wrinkles, etc. And being aware of when the climatic conditions are going to mean that you're more likely to get fly strike. And that's going to vary a bit from year to year, but generally it's spring and summer. So the larvae, once they've eaten away and made a big mess of your sheep, they normally drop off the sheep at night or in the early morning. They like the cool ground temperatures and they burrow into the soil where they pupate and hide. These are often around the sheep camps. So if you've got a sheep camp, that's where you're going to find them. Flies don't travel that far, so they only travel no more than 3 kilometres. And if preferable, they'd rather go and eat a live sheep rather than a dead one, unlike some other beasts which prefer to eat rotting meat. And the flies can actually live for up to a month, and in that time they can lay up to 600 eggs. The environmental temperatures, so this is, as I said, something we see in the spring and summer going into the autumn. The temperature needs to be 26 to 38 ideally. The temperature can drop down as low as 15 and you'll still see them, and it can get up above 40, but once it goes much above 40, again, the flies don't survive or whatever. They don't like that high temperature. Those nice, still, calm days is when they really thrive. If it's windy, then you don't get the fly activity. And as it gets really windy, so if you get 20 plus k's an hour, then you're going to have much reduced fly activity because the flies get blown away. The other thing about having it windy is that if it's been wet and then the wind comes through, that's going to dry the sheep, because wet sheep, especially sheep that were wet for more than a couple of days, are another really big risk. And wrinkly sheep, so think your merinos, your really wrinkly sheep, they are also going to get fly strike. So the strike risk, that warm, moist weather, is when you're going to see a fly strike and when you need to be keeping monitoring. Sheep are more likely to get struck if they've got long wool around their breech. Shearing should be timed around minimising fly strike and using treatments to minimise your fly strike. If you've got scoury sheep or daggy sheep, they're more likely to get struck. If you've got wrinkly sheep, if they've got short tails, because they switch their tails a lot, so you want to have your tail should be docked at the third knuckle after your third joint there. And plain-bodied sheep are less likely to get struck than wrinkly sheep. And the most important things that will mean that you got fly strike are dags and wrinkle, urine stain, and wool colour. So because wool, when it's stained, gets dark, then flies are also more likely to strike dark sheep or dark coloured wool sheep, because they think it's possibly going to be struck already and there's going to be open flesh there, even if it's not, it's just the natural wool colour of that sheep. So you can do a DAG score. Here's a DAG score and a wrinkle score. They're both similar. And so you score from 1 to 5. The score 2 lambs were twice as likely to be struck, and the score 3 times or 4 times more likely to be struck than a DAG 1 score. And the score 4 scores, so those really messy ones, are 7 times more likely to get breech strike. So trying to keep your sheep, have them crutched, have them short around the rear end and not scaring and not daggy, is going to really minimise your chance of getting breech strike. So why do sheep scour? Well, certainly worms are a big reason. Your scour worms in your winter rainfall is why they're likely to scour. Sometimes also a lot of larvae. They can get hypersensitive, and sheep generally, so they react actually to the worms being there rather than having a lot of worms themselves, and that still makes them scour. Some pastures and feed types are specific to some pasture types, things like brassicas. They'll all scour and brassicas. And also we get a thing called coccidiosis. It's another parasite. And We have very young lambs that are most likely to get it. As the lambs and the sheep get older, they are less likely to get there. And when I see coccidiosis, generally I'm concerned there's an underlying worm burden as well, because or poor nutrition. Coccidiosis is an opportunistic disease, as many diseases are. And so if you diagnose coccidiosis, you need to be saying, what's going on with my management? And occasionally also we see Salmonella and Yersinia, which are parasitic diseases, bacterial diseases that also cause scour. So there's a lot of reasons why sheep scour, but the problem is once they start scouring, you'll then like to get them struck as well. So the poor old sheep's being hammered from all sides. How do you detect fly strike? So you're looking for those sheep standing off by themselves, are looking miserable, they're sore, there's the maggots release a toxin that makes them toxic and sick. You can often smell them when you get close enough. You get moist, smelly wool, and the wool is pulled because it's itchy and they're trying to rub it. Sometimes you might see the maggots, they're lethargic, and they can get quite distressed. So to treat them, you need to remove all that infected wool. It's a lovely job I do not enjoy. You've got to clip away all that wool. You need to go at least 5 centimeters of clean wool away from where the fly strike is, so that the maggots are not underrunning, and because they will be running up into that wool. So you need to make sure that you've got all the area around the fly strike really, really clean. Go back a good 5 centimeters. Make sure you don't just chuck the maggots on the ground, dispose of them, because the last thing you want them is burying into the ground and producing more flies. So get rid of the maggots, put them in a bag, chuck them in the bin, clean the area. There's a whole heap of registered fly strike dressings that you can use, and I'll talk more about how you choose that in a minute. And if they're really bad, you might want to look at antibiotics and pain relief. But make sure you get rid of all those moist areas and look all over the sheep, because sometimes they are in more than one place. Okay, so the other thing you can do is different chemical treatments. So, and also timing your shearing and crutching. Now I'm going to point out now that the labeling on the bottom of this diagram is not correct, but and it came from a publication I got off the web. It's an AWI publication, I believe. If you crutch when it's getting into fly strike season, so normally fly strike season, particularly in a winter rainfall like we've got here, is going to be really high September, October, November, when it's most moist. And as it dries out, December, January, it's going to drop down. And by about April, May, you shouldn't be a risk at this time of year. And certainly if anywhere in the state as it's cold as it's been here the last couple of days, I imagine any poor flies well and truly hiding at the moment. But so basically, if you time your crushing or your shearing coming into spring, then put a chemical application there. And some of the chemical applications last a number of months, so that's going to keep it under control till February. And then, so I'm looking at the top diagram at the moment, and then what happens is that you start to get an increased risk, and then you shear them and treat them again, and that will get, or you may not even need to treat them. You can just shear them, which minimizes your chances of needing to treat. And then, yes, you'll probably get an increased risk for a short while, but then you hit winter and the risk goes away. Another way you can do it, and this again is there's lots of ways to kill this cat. It's just really a question of which way you decide to do it. So there's lots of ways of dealing with it. So you might decide you're going to shear in September, October. You've got short wool, so then you can use a chemical application a few weeks later, which will prolong your period where you don't have fly strike through until March. And as I said, those labels are reversed, and then you can crutch. Then again, not need to treat at that point, and you shouldn't have too much problem. You can keep it under control until May. So there's a whole heap of ways of doing it. Again, a question of getting the right advice. And at the same time, you need to be thinking about your chemical resistance again. And it's the same thing we're seeing in worms. The more chemicals we use, the more problems we have, the more resistant the flies become. So there's several different classes. I've got some pictures in a minute and what they are, but there's several different classes of chemicals and also non-chemical tools you can use. You need to know, again, the different chemical groups and try and, again, rotate them where you can, bearing in mind that you're going to have some longer acting treatments as preventative, and you also need something to treat anything that does get struck. Try and minimize and optimize the number and timing of the chemicals so that you're using things like shearing and crutching to control it as well. Always follow the label directions and really check throughout that season, regularly check for your fly strike. And then when you find it, make sure you're killing all your maggots. So the different classes, we have insect growth regulators, which have a long protection and they have no effect on lice. We have the spinosads, which are knockdowns. So the insect growth regulators basically mean the maggots can't develop. Then the spinosads, which actually again knocks them down, and that gives them medium-term protection. And then we have organophosphates, which are older type drugs, which are short residual and probably more likely to be resistant too, because they've been around longer. And then we have combinations, because again, that ability to put in combinations means that we may have less resistance. And again, you need to rotate the chemical groups. So consider the chemical groups that were applied last, either this season or at the end of the previous fly season, and where practical, avoid using a chemical from the same group. Then you need to think about the chemical group that was last used to control lice if you've got lice on your farm. And again, trying not to use a chemical from the same group. Oops, I just lost that. Hopefully we're back on the right page. And then finally, you need to look at the chemical group that you use to prevent fly strike. So you're looking at treatment, so the last time, and then the ones that you last used to prevent, you don't want to use as a dressing. The one thing I would say, again, this is highly complicated, but on wool.com, which is the AWI website, there is a whole heap of really good fly strike resources. So to get this right, I strongly recommend that you go to the wool.com website and download their fly strike resources. They've got like probably 10 or 20 different really good handouts that explain everything you need to know about fly strike. Again, here's a bit more about your chemical groups. You need to look at your label. You don't just want to work on your brand names. And I didn't say that so much with the wormers, but same thing. Don't worry about the brand names, different brand names. Most of those chemicals are available under different brand names. So you need to know what the actual active is and understand what the active is. So your different chemical groups are here, and understand what the group is, because often we'll have multiple chemicals applying to the same group. So when we're getting resistance to one in a group, we're going to get resistance to more than one. What will happen when you think you're getting resistance is that you've treated them and you think you're going to have them covered for 3 or 4 months, whatever it says on the packet, and you discover that you've got fly strike within 6 weeks. And that's telling you that either you haven't treated them correctly, or you're more likely going to have some sort of resistance. So if you want to actually work out if you have got resistance, so the Elizabeth MacArthur Ag Institute in just outside of Camden in New South Wales is doing some testing. They were doing it for free, unfortunately not. So the fun bit is you've got to find 60 healthy maggots. They've got to be Lucilia cuprina maggots. So you need to be able to identify those from the other maggots. So go look that up, because there's probably no point me telling you now. Find out how to identify those, collect at least 60 maggots and send them away. And you can get a result back telling you which chemicals are working on those maggots and which ones aren't. So again, with your fly strike, we're looking at an integrated approach. We don't have refugia, but we do have lots of ways we can do to minimize the risks, things like shearing, crutching, making sure that we control flies around the area, etc. And also breeding for resistance. So I didn't actually mention that, but again, if you're trying to breed and not have wrinkles, there's a couple of other, and DAG scores, both of those are hereditary, so you can actually breed those out as well. So a lot of these diseases you can actually control to an extent by selecting the right rams. When you're looking at insecticide resistance, whether it's lice or whether it's flies, you need to be rotating your groups, understanding which products are the same, not just for lice, but also for flies and worms. Try and avoid using the same class. making sure you use the correct dose and a thorough application. It's got to be, if you miss bits of the sheet when you're looking at trying to put a preventive on for fly strike, you need to make sure that is a really effective and it's applied as per the packet. When you're going to treat them with a preventative, you want to do all the sheep at the same time, and try and minimize your reliance on chemicals where you can. So really the same principle for lice. Hopefully you don't have lice in a property. They are another thing I mentioned last time as a biosecurity risk. But if you do, you're going to have well-timed flock treatment. You want to try and treat them off the shears, so you've got really short wool to get the most efficacious products. You want to have that really good biosecurity and monitor again for signs, particularly if you've got places they can come from, like you brought sheep in, etc., etc. So monitor for rubbing, fleece damage, lice, etc. You can find your lice if you put your glasses on and you inspect the sheep. So they often have fleece damage. You can see the lice scurrying around down in the wool there. And there is also a lice boss website as well that will give you good information on how to control them. Again, very similar chemicals, and you need to understand how they fit into your program. So you have porons, which you put off the shears. The skin contact's essential, and you need to have accurate dosing. You can have a dip, so you plunge or shower dip, and you're wetting your entire sheep down. So again, you want them off the shears, so it actually gets down to the skin. Follow your label rotes. You can jet them, but that's really only for fly strike, not a primary for lice. But there is now an oral treatment as well, which you can use. It's called Flexalt, and you can use it when you've got long wool there. So it's something you would consider if you're bringing sheep onto your property and you're worried about lice and they're coming in with long wool. So really important to have good quarantine when you're bringing sheep onto your property. There's a number of different things you should bring in. They could bring in, not that you should bring in, that they could bring in and you want to avoid. So first of all, check your history. We discussed all this last time. Know where your sheep have come from, know what they've been treated with, but always, no matter which vendor they come from, just really put them by themselves, keep them by themselves for a minimum of a month if possible. Make sure that they're exposed to all the worms and stuff on your property, but don't put them near your sheep. And particularly if they're pregnant, you want to keep them separated till all sheep have lambed. You want to have good secure boundary fences to keep your neighbour's sheep out. You want to collaborate with neighbours to try and get rid of lice, etc., around the whole area, and monitor and manage stray sheep. Don't let them on your property, because they'll be the ones that bring it on. Again, we're looking at integrated pest management strategies. So that's combining chemical and non-chemical methods by using shearing, crutching, etc., to minimize our risk. So with all these parasites, we want to use an integrated approach, combine chemicals, and understand your management tools, and realize that your management tools are going to be there forever, whereas your chemicals may not be. And you need to be using those management tools, even if they're harder work and more things going on. It's very easy to poke a chemical at a sheep, but the long and the short is that it's going to end up with not working down the track. If you've got problems with any of these diseases, you want to diagnose it early so you don't have sick animals. You want to make sure you apply your treatments correctly, mix them correctly, measure when you mix up. Don't just slosher this and slosher that. You want to make sure you've got your concentrations exactly as it says on the label, and practice strict biosecurity. And if you want more information, there's Lice Boss, Fly Boss, Worm Boss. These are excellent websites. They're updated regularly. They have really good things on them, to lots of product guides, etc., etc. There's also stuff on the Stock Sense website. There's some Stock Sense handouts as well, but they actually send you back often to Worm Boss, Lice Boss, and Fly Boss as well. So consult your animal health advisor is the other thing. So these are really complicated programs. And I see so many people that don't understand how these things work. They don't understand the different chemicals. And so if you're confused, and I don't blame you if you are, if you're confused by all these different chemicals and stuff like that, find somebody that can give you really good advice. Preferably, it may not need to be someone that's selling it, because if you can get some good independent advice, that's often worth having. And someone that knows your property and your situation and your animals. So that's where your vet often fits in. Okay, so moving on to vaccinations. Um, there's a whole heap of vaccinations out there for sheep, and they're there to prevent major infectious diseases, to improve animal welfare and productivity, and to reduce economic loss and antibiotic use, as well as supporting market access and biosecurity in some places. But basically, where we're mainly using them is to prevent preventable diseases, and they're often quite significant diseases that we don't want to have on our property. So here's a list of the common vaccines. So clostridiols, cheesy gland vaccines, erysipelas arthritis vaccines, Johne's disease vaccines, scabby mouth or ORF, Campylobacter abortion, foot rot, that's a new vaccine that's just been released this year, I believe, and Barber's poleworm. So there's a whole heap of different things we can be vaccinating for. So the clostridial diseases, there's 5 different, so standardly a 5 in 1, but in sheep we generally add a cheesy gland, and sometimes you can also get minerals and that are added in here as well, like B12 and selenium. But the key ones are your pulpy kidney and your tetanus. So your 3 in 1 also does pulpy kidney and tetanus, and in some areas where you don't have fluke, you may only need a 3 in 1. But the most common ones are your 6 in 1s, which include blackleg, black disease and malignant edema. They're all similar from similar bacteria called Clostridia. They're all very nasty soil-associated bacteria. They often pick them up after rain quite commonly, or when you're on a very high lush feed. They pick up these bacteria, they proliferate rapidly, they produce toxins, and often you just get dead animals and you never see anything wrong with them until they're dead. Your 6 and 7 ones adds in your cheesy gland or your erysipelas, and we now also have an 8 in 1 as well. So use all stock classes, and this is when you start off as lambs, and then you're going to have annual vaccinations. You might even have them more frequently, particularly with your 5 in 1 clostridials, if they are on crops, etc. It's something that really only lasts, maybe in some places, only 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on the prevalence and the risk. So if you're putting young stock onto crops, because your young stock are generally more susceptible, if you're putting stuff on grain, which I know a lot of people are doing at the moment, so you've got stock on grain, then you want to be thinking about boosting your clostridial diseases if you haven't done it in the last few months. So where you should always use it, you should give your first dose at marking, second dose 4 to 6 weeks later, which is generally at weaning. That second dose doesn't want to be much more than 8 weeks, else it won't work. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We want to have an annual booster for all sheep, and definitely before moving them into that high feed situation. Then we have cheesy gland and erysipelas. So these are included in your 6 in 1 and 7 in 1. You can also have them in other varieties, and there's a whole heap of different products out there. So I'm not going to cover them all now. So erysipelas arthritis, we see when you get arthritis in your sheep, some flocks really struggle with that. Often that is associated with poor hygiene at marking, particularly with tail docking. So you need to make sure that your tail docking, if you're getting a lot of arthritis, you need to be saying, well, what's going on with my tail docking? Is it hygienic enough? Am I doing it at the right place? If you're docking your tails too short, you're also more likely to get an infection, okay? So if you're getting erysipelas arthritis, rather than going for your vaccine, first of all, ask why you're getting it, and then you may find the vaccine is helpful when you've addressed the underlying factors. And the cheesy gland, the CLA, that causes increased lymph nodes, and as much as anything else, it's a carcass quality. So you get these big, cheesy, pussy lymph nodes. You get them on the back of the knees, you get them underneath the jaw, and they just get really big and fessy. And and it used to be really, really prevalent in Australia. It used to be like 80 or 90% of flocks have it. Now it's probably closer to 25 to 30%, and the vaccine has allowed us to control that. Yanis disease is a wasting disease of sheep. I did cover this last time. It's important with this vaccine that it has to be given to lambs between 4 and 16 weeks of age, ideally at marking, and then it gives lifelong protection. It's a nasty vaccine. If you're using it, you need to make sure that you don't inject yourself, because you'll get a very severe lesion if you do it. If you're introducing sheep and they haven't had it, then you can still vaccinate. But if they're outside of that 16 weeks, it probably won't be as efficacious. So important to actually make sure you do that in the right time. There's only one type. It's called Guedere. It's available from Zoetis. And you should actually put a permanent V tag in to show they're vaccinated, and use in all stock classes. Another one you might want to use if you get ORF. So ORF is a scabby mouth. You get it in some sheep. It's also highly contagious to humans. So if you've got ORF in your flock, don't let little kids feed your sheep. It's a live vaccine. You actually scratch the skin to apply it. It protects against scabby mouth. And it's just, again, a single dose at lamb marking, or if you get it in really young lambs, you can do it before marking. And it is required for some export markets, and you use it in lambs and unvaccinated adults in high-risk situations as well. But generally, you do it in your lambs unless you're trying to vaccinate in the face of an outbreak. And high risk, to be honest, some of you might actually be in a high-risk situation at the moment, because it's often when you've got sheep in containment and they're close together that scabby mouth is a problem. Another one, particularly if you're going to be buying in sheep after the drought and you're building up again, be concerned about Campylobacter abortion, because it is one we can vaccinate for. You give it for flocks with an abortion history. If you're buying in sheep, you should always do it, because you may not know the abortion history of either those animals or maybe yours, because sometimes it's kicking around in your flock and not causing a lot of trouble, but you bring in a whole heap of naive sheep and it can cause a problem. So 2 doses, the first at joining, the second 3 to 4 weeks later, and an annual booster. And using maiden and mature ewes if the abortion is present, but otherwise definitely give to your maidens when you're bringing them into your flock. And now we also have a foot rot vaccine, and in some states it's actually restricted and you have to have a permit, but apparently not in Victoria. It works against 10 different strains of foot rot, but it is a new vaccine. You need to know exactly how to use it, and you need to make sure you give it to the right sheep. You need to have at least 2 doses 6 weeks apart for maximum effectiveness. And if you are struggling with foot rot, again, talk to your trusted animal health advisor about that. The final vaccine that you might want to put in your program is Barber's pole worm vaccine. So where we're struggling with Barber's pole drench resistance, there's quite a few people here now using it. You have to vaccinate your sheep at least 3 times at 6-week intervals. So generally you start at marking, you do them again at weaning, and then you do them again 6 weeks after that. And if you're spring lambing, then by the time you get the Barber's pole risk build up in around November time or after Christmas, they've actually got enough vaccine on board. And then you need to keep boosting. So unfortunately, the protection doesn't last very long. So you need to boost each season. And whenever you boost, it's only going to probably last for about 6 weeks, and then you need to give another vaccine. So it's not ideal, but if you've got drench resistance and you don't want to keep drenching them, I know people using it. It is very effective at controlling Barber's pole. You still can have a problem with your scour vaccines, but in the summer, this is one way to reduce the number of chemicals you're using and help prolong the ones that are working. But it's not a substitute for drenching, and it's a flock level, so you don't do it for individual animals. It's a flock level protection to reduce the number of Barber's pole eggs on the paddock and reduce the infectivity, rather than being specific protection for an individual animal. Okay, so let's just finish off with good principles for effective vaccination. We want to follow label instructions. Always read your labels. They do change sometimes. Make sure that you're storing your chemicals right, you're giving them the right dose, you know the weight of your animals that you're drenching or vaccinating, and certainly if you're drenching, that you're weighing your sheep and drenching to the heaviest sheep for drenching. Make sure you know where to give it. If it says it needs to be kept cold, keep it cold. Use clean, sterilised equipment. Make sure if you use multi-dose, multi-use vaccinator guns, you clean them out in boiling water. You clean and sterilise as per it says on the instructions, and you don't just have a vaccine gun sitting around from one application to the next growing bugs in it. And my preference is that you take your packets off your vaccinator guns, because those tubes and those guns are never sterile. Okay, so I know that some people like to leave them all connected and then they're going to be ready to use next time. And maybe if next time's tomorrow, that's fine. But if it's going to be a number of days, you're asking for the risk of bugs to be growing in your vaccines in the tubes. So I would say disconnect everything off your vaccine packet if you can reuse it. And some vaccines you can't reuse because they need to be used within 24 hours or 12 hours. But with most vaccines, there is a reuse time. So disconnect the packet, use Metho to clean it up, put it upright in the fridge, maybe even put a bit of protective tape over the top. And then when you take it out, connect it to a new clean gun with a clean tube on it, rather than us having that older tube floating around in the fridge with the gun that's been used 20 times. Probably got some bug in there somewhere. It'll be happily breeding away in between use, particularly if you don't put it in the fridge. So always put them in the fridge. So use clean, sterilised equipment and make sure you record all vaccinations. That's critical for your LPA accreditation. You need to have a record of all these things you give, because a lot of them will have withhold periods, really particularly with your wormers. Some of them have quite long withhold periods and even longer ESI, which is an export rating, okay? So you need to have records of all of this. So if you're selling stock, if you get audited, you know exactly what you can and can't sell. And it is there's a lot of things I've discussed tonight, so really consult your vet for a flock-specific program that is based around how you lamb, when you lamb, etc., etc. Just going back to vaccines, the best practice, it is also another thing you need to look at the packet is the vaccine dose and the vaccine and the interval between vaccination. So a lot of vaccines, and your 5-in-1 and 6-in-1 is classic like this. When your lamb is born, it gets colostrum, that gives it maternal antibodies. By the time it's a few weeks old, so 6 weeks old or less at marking, those maternal antibodies are decreasing. You give it a vaccine, and as long as the maternal antibodies aren't too high, that will then end up with the sheep remembering that vaccine. However, the immune system does have a memory, but it needs a bit of memory jogging before it works. So with most vaccines, particularly killed vaccines, which most of our vaccines are in Australia, we have to give a second dose, and we have to give that second dose at a specific interval as put on the packet. So with most of our 6-in-1s, it's give within 4 to 6 weeks. We can stretch it out to 8, but not much longer. If you don't give your second dose till 4 months later, then the sheep's gone and forgotten about that first dose, and you're back to starting all over again. It's not going to have that memory there if it only ever had 1 dose. But if you give it the 2 doses, and then you're a couple of months late with giving the annual booster, because it had those 2 doses, it stimulates those memory cells. You can still remember, and they're floating around in the back there. Oh, I remember that. I've seen that nasty thing before. I'm going to get an immune response. And so that's how, so looking here, we've got, so basically here's your maternal antibodies, here's our first dose here, little tiny response, we give a second dose, we get a massive response, that lasts for a number of months, depending on the type of vaccine, and then when they start to wane, you give it off and off we go again, and we get yet another, um, spike of antibodies so that our animal is protected. Okay, injection sites. I actually had a case of that this week. And where do we inject? Okay, and most of the time with sheep, we're giving them an awful lot of things. You know, we might be giving them an injectable wormer, a vaccine, a mineral supplement, etc., etc. And all those things are formulated separately and they work separately. So we don't want to give them in the same 3 inches of sheep. We need to be spreading these things out. Now, they all say give high on the neck. The reason they say give high on the neck is that We want to minimize carcass damage, but that real top of the neck there's a little space in behind the ear, but there's not much room. There's a lot of cartilage, there's a lot of lymph nodes, etc. There's the carotid artery that you can inadvertently hit. So if you come a little bit further down the neck, then there's a bit of loose skin, and that will allow you then to spread out these different treatments. Preferably, where possible, you want to give, if you're giving multiple, you want to give one on either side of the neck, and then you're not got all these different chemicals mixing under the skin, because your vaccines, they need to stimulate immune response, and so they've got something in there that is going to make the body sort of attack it, and then you've got a wormer or a B12 shot or something that wants to get absorbed, and having those things all mixing together means that they won't all work very well. So always read the packet, always use 1/4 inch needles for anything being in under the skin. There's a massive loss um, of necks from sheep because people give everything in longer needles and they end up putting it into the muscle and the whole neck. So if the carcass is contaminated, there's lumps and bumps, they often cut the whole neck off. Okay, so use your 1/4 inch needles, put it in at 45 degrees. Really try not to give something that says give under the skin into the muscle. Spread out where you give it and make sure that you know whether it goes under the skin or in the muscle, depending on the product, and give it in the right place. So, in summary, when vaccinating, a vaccine isn't a panacea or an answer. We still want to do everything else right to make sure animals don't get sick. So we want to have good nutrition, good parasite control, good biosecurity. So we've got really healthy animals, and that's more important than the vaccine. But the vaccine's there to protect when things fall over, but we don't want to have to rely on it. We need to know when our high risk periods are, so lambing, weaning, shearing, etc., moving them onto grain, with our Scabivax, mixing them all together as lambs. So we want to know when we're going to have that risk and vaccinate appropriate to that risk. We want to monitor our flock health, make sure our vaccines are working, make sure our animals are healthy, and adjust the program if we need to. And if you're not sure how to put it together, the other thing that AgVic do, and because I've run a few of these, is they have some animal health planning days where you plan out a whole animal health calendar based on all your classes of animals and um, and the different things you need to protect for. And you go away with the calendar that gives you a whole plan. So you can ask your vet to do that, or AgVic will also run these days that do that as well. So watch out for one of those in your area. Then remember that vaccination is an essential part of sheep health and productivity, but you need to use the right vaccine at the right time for the right stock class, and consult your vet for specific advice. I think I've said that a few times now, but it was part on the importance of the vet-farmer relationship, and having a vet that understands your property, understands what you're trying to do, and understands where your disease risks are should be a real asset to your business. And so I'd really encourage you to try and develop a relationship with someone that works near you. It's particularly because these animal programs are complex. So I'm sure that if there's lots of people out here have understood everything I've said, picked up the odd mistake, you're doing really well. But basically, they are a complicated thing. They are individually tailored, and you need to be able to think about that for yourself. You need to understand the different risk factors for your different classes of stock, etc. So all of those things I've talked about tonight could be on your animal health plan. It's just a question of where it fits in and getting advice to do that. Right. How are we going? I ran over this time.
Going well for time. Thanks, Alison. There's some really thorough information in there, which is great. And it's nice to have it all in one place and thinking about it together. If you have a question, you can click on the Q&A box and type that in, and we'll try to answer those now. There are a few for you, Alison, already.
Great.
Do you recommend getting a microscope and the special equipment to do your own egg counts?
Depends how many you do. They're not, it's not hard to learn how to do it, but a microscope's going to set you back a few $100s. You can do a lot of worm egg counts for that. And it depends also on, like you can actually get it done for free in a lot of places, or We do worm egg counts here. I make sure my egg counts generally arrive with a bit of specific advice for the farms I'm working with. So do I recommend it? I think unless you do quite a lot of it, if you've got lots of sheep and lots of different classes and everything else, then maybe. But I honestly think there's so many other ways of getting worm egg counts done now. And often you want to get that advice and that product that unless you're a real keen, you want to spend half an hour grinding up some sheep poo, waiting for it to float, and then looking underneath the microscope. And I know you can get easier ways of buying kits and having it done online, but they're still not cheap. So I think it depends on the size of your flock, how often you think you need to do them, and how far you are from town probably, and how easy is it to get done in your local area.
Great, there's a few factors to think about there. Also, for a small flock, how many samples do you need?
So minimum 10 generally, unless you've only got less than 10 sheep, at which point you do all of them. And be pretty clear, like most labs would have a form or something you can fill in. So for a small flock, you'd want 10 sheep representative across all of your sheep, unless they're handled and managed different. So if you have rams that are treated completely different, you use different products, you might want to collect them separately. But yes, so you just need 10. If you've got larger flocks, then you might want to be collecting feces from 20 or 30 or 40, depending on the size of your flock. Again, get advice from whoever does your worm egg counts.
Yep. Right. Can you treat the pasture to control worm counts?
No, and it's something we've talked about. I think there's been research into it, but and we can't even, unfortunately, because what I reckon would be really good would be able to actually just collect some pasture and do worm egg counts on the pasture and see where your high risk pasture is. And people have looked at it, but it's very time consuming. It's not commercially viable or easy to do, and unfortunately, there is no treatment. No. But what you can probably do, again, if you've got a small flock, is think about picking up, like I do know people with really small flocks really struggling with overstocking, etc. You can go around and sweep up all your sheep poo, try and get the sheep poo out of the place. If you're keen and enthusiastic and haven't got many sheep and you're struggling with having to drench them so often, then that can certainly be a way that you can get on top of it. But it is quite intensive.
Thanks. Can kangaroos keep the worm cycle going when no sheep are in the paddock?
Pretty certain not, because worms are generally host specific, so not even cattle. There is one worm that sometimes cows pick up that sheep get as well, but even cattle and sheep have got different worms. So I'm pretty certain kangaroos don't do that because they'd have their own kangaroo worms.
And how about goats?
Goats can, yes. A lot of those worms are between goats and sheep. And the thing about goats is that there's many more products that are not registered. And they metabolize the products that they are there very fast. So sometimes you have to use different off-label doses. But the biggest problem with goats is there's not many stuff that's actually registered for use on goats. So you're always doing it off-label and you're often using higher doses.
If you completely destock for 4 to 6 months, can you eliminate worms from your property to create a clean slate?
Not 4 to 6 months. You'd need to destock for at least 12 months.
At least
It
12.
needs some dry, unless it was really, having said that, because most of the state has been so dry, if you destocked at the beginning of the drought and you'd had really hot, dry time over the summer, then maybe you would get rid of it's the scour worms that are a problem that hang around a long time, but it's got to be hot and dry for all of that, for a lot of that time with temperatures above 30 degrees, then it might work. But if you do it over the winter, they survive for much longer than that over the winter in sheep pats, etc.
Can you comment on leaving, say, 10% of fat, healthy animals undrenched as a form of refugia?
Yeah, that's another way you can absolutely do it. Totally.
That's possible.
So
Yeah.
that's a good way of doing it as well. It's any way like I've done a little bit of work in the tropics with sort of less developed countries, and they hardly ever blanket drench everything. They just do it when it's needed. But it's definitely a way, if the sheep are healthy enough and not high risk, they're not about to lamb, then it's definitely another way of minimizing the chance of drench resistance and keeping those susceptible worms in your population.
We have We already have resistance to triple drench. What's the possibility that through management we can get that drench effective again?
You probably need to use other drenches for at least 3 or 4 years. Um, I do often wonder whether you could just go and find another farm and get some poo from there, but I don't think anyone's ever done that or made it work. So if you don't, but the problem is particularly with the triple drench is that even those new actives, the Zolvix and the StarTech to talk about, they've got ivermectin in there as well. So if they're not working 100%, you're still exposing your sheep to ivermectin. So I've definitely got clients with resistance to triple drench as well. So by using the StarTech, the Zolvix, the Polax, and the other organophosphates, and trying not to use a triple drench for a while. And it also depends on the degree of resistance you have and whether it's in your scaleworms or in your barber's pole. So not impossible, but it's a hard and tough place to be, and it depends on the worms. Because the other thing, if it was Barber's pole, you might be able to look at Barber Vax and throw that into the mix as well. But again, get specific advice from your vet on that problem.
If you have 25 sheep to keep the grass down on a small property, and there are no signs of any diseases, is it important to vaccinate still?
Okay, so vaccination is a risk management strategy. Okay, and I think and it depends what you're going to be doing with your sheep. So the thing about pulpy kidney and those clostridial diseases is that you don't see disease, you just see dead animals. There's times a year when you see a lot of it. If, for instance, it gets really dry and you have too many sheep, you need to start feeding grain, etc., etc. So it depends on how bad you're going to feel if you walk out and find 4 dead sheep, I guess, because that's what you're going to find if you don't vaccinate. A lot of the other diseases are probably in that situation if you're not using them, if you're not lambing down, etc. A lot of those other diseases are less of a risk. So your cheesy gland is really a carcass quality thing. So if those animals were never going to get sold for meat, then maybe you wouldn't worry about it. If they're going to get sold for meat, having that cheesy gland component is also important. But many of those other things, either things like yoni should have been done when they're 4 to 16 weeks, so it's either been done or hasn't at that point. Many of those other things are more at risk if you're breeding or if you're trading or bringing specific animals in. So it would be the 6-in-1, which isn't that expensive, that I would probably be doing on an annual basis.
And am I correct in saying that some of those diseases they might be in the soil for 10 or 15 years?
Yeah, Clostridials particularly, that they hang around for a long, long time. So they're actually soil-borne organisms. They're also often in the gut. So they're actually there naturally at low levels. It's just when they get out of whack. So when you change the diet really suddenly, those bacteria that are floating around at very low levels because they're in the soil and they're in the gut, suddenly get out of whack, that you get a problem.
Thanks, Alison. One more question. If you live in an area with no vet, is there an online service that
Yeah, there's a couple actually. There's one by a guy called Tristan Jubb, who's a colleague of mine, called Phonovet. We actually do like it depends on where you are, but it is legal within Victoria to do a televet consult. So there are a number of vets that can do that. Obviously, if you need drugs, it's probably best to find one near you, because then they can get it to you. But now with all the common, um, it's not hard to get stuff freighted across the state either. So there are rules and regulations on what you can do if you don't haven't been on the farm, but we can definitely do some consults.
right? And I had a question, Alison, about buying drench and vaccines in a store. If they've got the same active ingredient, one's a lot cheaper. Are you just buying the brand? What's
You're
your
buying brand.
recommendation?
Generally, you're buying brand. Sometimes you're buying a slightly more efficacious transport, but yeah, a lot of these brands were patented for a while, and it was the only one, and now there's a lot of generics there. So it's like when you go into the chemist and they say, "Do you want the original brand or the generic brand?" Obviously, if you're buying the brand, the original brand, then you're often those are the companies that are also doing research and development. So someone like, now I won't mention because there's a few of them, but there's some companies out there do a lot of research and development, and that's where our new product's coming from. So yes, you're paying more for their product, but you're also hopefully supporting research and development. But generally it's exactly the same product. So it's your ethical view on whether you want to be supporting research and development, or you just want to find the cheapest thing you can get because it's probably going to do the same job.
Makes sense. Well, thanks for your time tonight, Alison.
No
It's
worries.
been great. And thanks everyone for joining. I will send an email out with a link to the recording and also for the slides. And don't forget, we have a lambing webinar series next week taking place. So if you haven't signed up and would like to attend, please head to our website. I'll also include a link in the email so you can register for that. Thanks again. Have a great night.
Yeah, hopefully I've answered all your questions, and good to do these couple of evenings. Thanks, Dawn, for the opportunity.
No worries.